Hey everyone, welcome to the Psyched to Practice podcast, your one stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insight from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. I'm your host, Dr. Ray Christner, and with me,
Paul Wagner.
And Paul, I was excited today for us to do a Masters in Practice episode. We haven't done one for a little while, it feels like, and had two just great guests join us today.
Well, and I think this is our first repeat guest, so really happy to have Dr. Sandra Pimentel back, or Sandy, as throughout the episode, you'll hear us refer to, and a new face on the Psyched to Practice podcast, Dr. Brian Chu, and, both just phenomenal guests and primarily here talking about their new book, CBT Treatment Plans and Interventions for Depression and Anxiety Disorders in Youth. And, we were kind of going through and talking a bit about it, and just so much good information there. And, I think even earlier on, we were talking about how it tries to make it both like academic, but then it also has a practical piece to it as well. And I think, referencing the book, it's certainly there, but hearing them talking about it, I see where it comes from.
Yeah, really an excellent book. And, it's always fun for me to go back and read books that, do have this really nice foundational quality to them. Because, despite how many years, you do these things, there's always these little tidbits that you find in how somebody writes something that just adds to it. And that's kind of how I felt kind of not only looking at their book, but kind of listening to them talk today. And, I think for me, my takeaway really was kind of this metaphor they used about treatment planning and talking about it as a roadmap. And, it gave me kind of a bunch of different thoughts as we were kind of going out and just things I've learned in the past. But I think this idea of kind of, knowing where we're going, setting a map in place to get there, and realizing that, we may have to take an alternate route because of whatever comes up during therapy. I think it's just a great framework to kind of keep in mind. And I think in their book, they really did a good job of outlining how that actually looks in practice. So the roadmap metaphor is probably my takeaway. How about for you?
I certainly love the roadmap. The other thing that really stood out when it actually came about because of an unexpected shift, I used the word stages of treatment rather than phases of treatment when asking a question. And, Brian stopped and really kind of brought attention to it. And I thought that was such a valuable thing because, he's talking about, these different areas. And in the book, it's written in different chapters, but that they're not these discrete stages. We don't go stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, but I think he even used the term like a Venn diagram. It's this blending of phases. So early treatment phase into the middle treatment phase into the ending treatment phase. And, I think there's a fluidity there that really is nice because it's not, okay, on to the next, but it's this slower transition of, okay, that we hang out in that middle ground of the Venn diagram before we're into maybe that whole next phase. And, it's just a really valuable thing that was shared. And I think looking back, hearing that concept throughout the episode.
Yeah, I agree. And both Brian and Sandy kind of do a really good job of introducing themselves. And I don't think we'll necessarily repeat it here. I do just want to throw a quick call out to Sandy that one thing she doesn't mention is that she is the upcoming president for the Association of Behavior and Cognitive Therapies. And that'll be starting here for the next year. And that's a huge career accomplishment that she, didn't say in her introduction, but just want to call out and a congratulations to her for taking that on and really servicing the field in general. So with that, those of you listening, please share your insights on social media. We'd love to hear from you and your thoughts about this episode.
And with that, we hope you enjoy this Masters in Practice episode. CBT Treatment Planning and Interventions.
So welcome, Brian and Sandy. Thank you both so much for joining us today. And we're excited to talk a little bit about the new book that you have coming out. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Ray, Paul. Yeah, it's nice to be back. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. My inaugural spin on this podcast.
Great. Well, we're glad to give you kind of the first experience, Brian. So they all just from now on aren't going to be as good. So that's so. Before we kind of get into the content of your book, and Sandy's been a guest with us before, but we enjoy giving our listeners a little bit about individuals' backgrounds who join us. So I'd kind of be interested in hearing a little bit from both of you about what led you into your work in mental health. And Brian, let's maybe start with you since you're a first time with us.
Oh, yeah, happy to. And again, thanks, Ray and Paul, for having us on. Been following your podcast for a little bit and listened to a couple of them. I just love the kind of conversations that you guys are having. And so I really appreciate the ability to come here and
thank you.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Right now, I am a professor in the clinical psychology department at the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology, and just recently former department chair for that same department at Rutgers University, and director of the Youth Anxiety and Depression Clinic. And, in some ways, the ways that I came to that place is both familiar and straightforward, and in some ways a little bit circuitous. I went to college thinking with much broader ideas about changing the world and having an impact. I went there thinking I was going to be an economics and philosophy major. At the time, I went in the 90s, and there's, at the time, really big picture issues about international relations and politics and economics that I was really interested in. And so I went there thinking I was going to be, really trying to help out with kind of, international relations in that capacity. And I dutifully went to my classes and tried to really get into the derivatives and other kinds of calculus that's associated with calculus, with the economics. And yet I found myself, like, all my extracurricular activities were all oriented around people. Like, I was doing community service. I was volunteering at the Ronald McDonald House. I was, helping out with, kids with depression. My all of the things I spent outside of my quote unquote school and work were around people. And so, I guess I didn't know this at the time, but just kind of presaging just the whole belief that, your actions speak louder than your words and thoughts and kind of stated values. I started thinking, well, what if I actually spent my time during the school day doing the things that I liked to do outside of the school day, and started taking some psychology classes and realized, oh goodness, class could be so interesting. And I was always interested in, say, economics and philosophy from a conceptual level, but from a combined conceptual and practical level, I didn't really make the connections. I couldn't kind of connect the dots in terms of, like, what would I do with this and how would I find meaning? And I think combining that, the kind of the work you put into it, combined with your natural instincts and interests, really just paired well with me. And so I started to, not so gradually, but quickly kind of just convert over to a major in psychology, and pursued more and more kind of experiences, both, kind of practical and research, and the rest is, as they say, is history, and had a pretty relatively straightforward path since then, but that's what got me into it.
Yeah, great. And so, Sandy, I know you've kind of given this to us before, but maybe give us a little refresher on what got you into mental health.
Yeah, sure. It's sort of a variation on a similar theme. I think, like Brian, I went into college with one idea in mind. I'm the daughter of Portuguese immigrants, and first in my immediate family to go to college. And I was pre-med, of course. And I took bio classes and did the bio class thing. And I also at the same time took a psychology class and kind of liked that better. In breaking it to my mom that Christmas, she said, pre-med, I thought you were going to be a journalist. You're always writing. And so I use that example often when I talk to the kids I work with, And, the combination of hard work, good luck, where I have an aunt who's a clinical psychologist and was studying it at the time. I was coaching softball and working with teenagers. And, then I got a job as a research assistant with the United Way, and I got to do some community work, this intersection of health and mental health. And so I decided to continue on the path and go into clinical psychology, and did graduate work, which is where I met Brian. And again, sort of some combination of sort of landing in the right spot. I was a good dose of naivete in sort of finding good people. And then, present day, I'm currently the chief of child and adolescent psychology in the Bronx. I love working in the Bronx. It's very reminiscent to me of where I grew up in Newark, New Jersey. Sort of making my way here was a natural, good fit for me in the service I wanted to do. I'm also the director of our anxiety and mood program and our child program, and associate director of our clinical psychology internship and training program. So, sort of finding the path, good luck, hard work, good people. Nice.
Yeah, it's interesting. We, after doing this for a little over a year, I think we've only had maybe one person who said, I went to psychology because I knew I wanted to do that my whole life. Yeah, everybody else, it's a whole different path to get there, which I always find kind of interesting. Maybe it's the right calling for us when we go that direction. So, you mentioned about the two of you kind of connecting through a graduate school kind of program. I guess I'm interested in what inspired the two of you to work together on your new book, talking about treatment planning.
Gosh, we unified over the content and the concept of the book over the fact that, each of us, I think in our respective roles really focus a lot of time as CBT instructors and supervisors, spending a lot of time bringing up the next generation. It's scary to say it like that of clinicians, but we spend a lot of time doing training and thinking that out. And I know for me, anytime that I would try to teach, I just was having a hard time finding the kinds of forms, worksheets, and principles all in one place. And so I was always making up my own worksheets as I went when I would ever teach or supervise. And I just kind of wanted, that. And I realized at some point I had amassed a whole library of these worksheets. And I thought, how can we get these out into the public in a way that's kind of coherent? And so, that was a lot of the interest for me, as well as trying to put to bed some of the myths about CBT. There's so much kind of presumptions, that students get when they go through traditional graduate training. That CBT is overly simplistic, or that it's really rigid. It's really built for simple problems and not for the real world. I think all of those, we hear those messages all the time, and we really wanted to create something that was, something that was principles focused, something that really steeped you in the, traditional and kind of current contemporary conceptualizations of cognitive behavioral, thinking and strategies, but also could be applied directly and flexibly. And so that's what the intention of this book really is designed to do. I don't know, Sandy, what did I leave out?
Yeah, for me, it was easy. Brian asked me, and it was an easy yes. Some combination of, oh, yeah, absolutely, of course, and imposter syndrome. Me? What? Oh, goodness, Brian is a little older than me in our program and is a little senior. So I had the good fortune of, Brian sort of shepherding through graduate school and sort of being someone who I admired in terms of his work ethic and just collegiality. And so it was an easy yes in that regard. And we had sort of a shared vision once we started talking about it. As you said, we are both, I think, clinicians at heart, teachers at heart, putting it all in one place. And the process, as much as the content, it was fun. It was fun to get to be able to sort of come together with Brian and, sort of imagine the vision of what this could be and what we thought was important. And so, yeah, it was an easy yes. It was a little harder to do, but an easy yes. When you throw in a pandemic, right, to add a few complications. And I look back and I was like, wow, who were those, people working at all hours to get this done? And with Brian and our partnership and sort of putting this shared vision together, it was great. It was really just a lovely process.
Yeah, that's great.
I alluded to the history. I just briefly wanted to, since Sandy kind of talked about how I asked her. It came because the earliest form of this book started out in 2008, and I was originally the more junior co-author, and the senior author was Steve Shirk, who had asked me to join in on this. He was approached by Guilford originally, and he ended up having to bow out for health reasons. And I ended up going through, trying to find other co-authors and ended up settling on a second one who also had to kind of bow out. And so this project, and the reason I thought this was relevant is just because it's another theme about you just don't know what the process and pathway might be from start to finish. And there are many ways to get there. But it's been a really nice way. And the reason why Roads led to Sandy is because after a while I was thinking, well, maybe we should just let this project drop. Maybe it's not worth it. Maybe it's too much effort. And I was just thinking, like, if I was to take one more shot at a co-author, who would it be? And I just was thinking, I need someone who is really just fun to work with because so that it makes the process go really smoothly, and B, someone who knows how to get things done. And that leads you to Sandy Pimentel for sure.
Well, and see, I was thinking when you said like you wanted to kind of kill the myth of cognitive behavior therapy having this rigidity, there's no better co-author than the person who put Cardi B in CBT. So it's like there's no less rigidity than it makes sense.
Yes. And certainly after getting to review the book and hearing you both describe it like that passion for teaching, like that academic part of like, we're breaking down and trying to have a deeper understanding of CBT in the way that it really presents in treatment. But also then it being a transitional piece into like, okay, so we take this academic information, but how do we make it practical, and really seeing the balance of that in the book coming through.
Yeah, that's what we were aiming for. So I'm glad, and that's very validating in terms of what we were shooting for. We wanted it to be real. We wanted it to be what we would want as clinicians and teachers to be able to sort of provide, as Brian mentioned, sort of having worksheets that we would develop ourselves and be able to use that we thought were useful, and wanted it to be a useful guide. And so that's very special, Paul. So thank you for saying that.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if you've done this yet, but like in prep for this podcast, I actually sat down with the hard copy of the book. We work so much in the electronic files and everything. Like this is the first time I kind of like actually flipped through, really looking through the book. It's a big and heavy book. And usually when I would say something like that in regards to a kind of like a clinician guide, like that would be a negative, but I'll say that, what I'm gratified about is that the reason why it's so lengthy is not because there's denseness of information, but because we filled it with so many vignettes and examples. And it's really about scripting and giving, dialogue that people can see and hear, and also the worksheets that go along with it. So you really see it illustrated. So it's something where maybe traditionally in CBT, part of the shortcomings in how other materials present itself is that, it's a lot of words and it's relying on the therapist to be able to figure it out. And we want to take some of that out and make it a little bit easier on the everyday clinician. And like that.
Well, if we're almost talking about some of that practicality, I'd like to actually jump into talking about the book here a bit. One of the things that really jumped out to me right away, when I was reviewing it, is talking about, the phases of CBT treatment, and really the starting point of, this development of a treatment plan, the conceptualization, and it really kind of coming together here. So for both of you, like, what is the value of thinking of treatment in this way, where it is more of a process that changes over time, rather than more of like, a static, once we have the treatment plan, it's set. Why do you think it's valuable for us to approach it in that way?
I can jump in to start. Paul, Ray, Brian and I are CBT nerds, proud CBT nerds. And we like to zoom out and look at the sort of the principles of CBT, as Brian was saying, to really guide the treatment. And so to counter the myths of CBT that it is fixed or that it is this cookbook, we both were very intentional in our choice about sort of having this drive, the emphasis of the book, to have it be a way to personalize treatment, have it be a way to sort of guide the treatment planning by relying on CBT principles and how to capture that. You know, with all therapy and with many endeavors, there's sort of a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so Brian and I, you know, this book could have been 1,000 pages, you know, left to our own devices, really. And that was an intentional choice in the beginning. It was structured actually a little bit, to give you a little bit of the, you know, background process again, it was structured a little bit differently in the first set of outlines. And we really put our heads together to answer that very question that you raised, Paul. And so that's why we decided on the phase approach to sort of pull it out so that we can describe it and then really get into some of these case examples where we thought we could sort of flesh out the strategies and the techniques and the goal, you know, the goal setting and some of the other strategies that are throughout the sessions that we described.
And well, maybe if we're jumping into some of the phases, talking about this, the first chapter, I think really focuses on that first phase of, of treatment. And would you, either of you mind kind of jumping in and talking a little bit about, you know, what really is encompassed in this first early treatment phase? What are we looking for? What stands out?
Yeah, I think as Sandy's kind of laying out is that, any quality therapy, CBT or otherwise, has to start with the case conceptualization. And so that's the framework in which we want to embed any of our thinking about a person and family, and then also how you work with them, you know, as you conceptualize. And the important thing is that conceptualization continues to grow and get informed and be iterative as you go throughout treatment. And so when we talk about phases, it's like really at the beginning, we start building the conceptualization, but you always come back as you get more information, you learn more about your client and family, and you'll update and revise that conceptualization. But that initial conceptualization would start, and I think this is critically, equally or importantly informed by a couple of different elements, which I think would be familiar to most of your audience, which is target problems. You can call whatever you want, but the reasons that bring clients into to therapy, right? What is the most salient functional impairment that is concerning to them? That's critical. And when you're talking about kids, obviously you have to be assessing that from the youth perspective, from the parents, the caregivers perspective, and any other invested stakeholder. That could be other family members, that could be siblings, it could be teachers or other. And so it's critical to have that sense about who is weighing in on this kid's functioning. Then some formal assessments, right? Formal assessments help also inform. We give resources and leads for semi-structured and standardized diagnostic interviews, self-report measures, so that you can carry out a multi-reporter, multi-dimensional assessment, so that you have combined information and really marry those things to understand what is this family's goal in therapy, and have some information about, what are the kind of processes or mechanisms or mini targets that you can really focus on in therapy, right? And so that basis of assessment starts you thinking about, okay, if we're looking at a broad diagnosis of, say, social anxiety disorder or something like that, there also are a number of specific goals within that. So how does that manifest itself? Are we talking about, talking to other kids and peers, same age peers in school? Is it more about with authority figures? Is it more of like a teenager and going to their first job or interviews, or going to try out for performances or for competition? And in those places, where does the child actually have the biggest stumbling blocks? Is it in their thinking patterns? Is it in their behavioral stuck points? Or is it in their kind of physiological reactions and their emotional regulation? An assessment helps you identify where that individual's kind of unique reactions and stuck points are, and put that in the context of their life. Then you can start thinking, okay, now I can start prioritizing these potential strategies to address those needs. It has to start with an assessment and your thinking, your conceptualization about what's going on for the kid.
And certainly, in the session, I think so often, this part is something that at least for the clients I work with, they're wanting to rush through it because they're wanting to get to the action. Like, okay, so what do I do? Like, how do I make this change? But the importance and value both, like, for us as clinicians to really hear and, forming an accurate assessment and understanding of what is this target problem? How is it manifesting? Because we can throw all the interventions out that we want, but if we're not really tailoring the treatment well and, having it, building this framework that we can then start to really a starting point to then track and see how things progress, then, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But this just really helps us have this accurate, tailored treatment. And it's one thing, really, I think I have to work with my clients to set that expectation well of we're going to get to the action phase, but we're not quite there yet. First few sessions, that's not the time for this.
And I'll say, in terms of that point and related to what Brian is saying, the assessment is ongoing. And sometimes people get stuck. Oh, we're going to do the assessment and then we're going to do the treatment. Or even with rapport building, we see that, I have to get to know the patient and then we can do the treatment. Whereas, using this model of it's all assessment that we're refining as we get this information, whether it's about symptoms or impairments of functioning or about, and goals. And we know working with, parents and caregivers. And I did my dissertation, on parent-child agreement on symptoms and syndromes. And I'll cut to the chase. They don't agree. That's a pretty robust finding, regardless of what we're asking, which is an interesting point in and of itself. And sort of finding a way to, sometimes, look at those goals and sometimes pick a lower hanging fruit if you need to, or get the win with a child patient. That's all assessment and decision making that you, by doing this approach and sort of assessing and in this ongoing way and building rapport. Rapport building is also assessment. Rapport building is, you mentioned Cardi B, Ray, sort of getting to the heart of knowing the patient and family in front of you and how you're going to further personalize the conceptualization and how you're going to get and help kids do the things that they might be avoiding, or get kids and families to sort of appreciate. We're using metaphors to sort of get some of our own points across. So, if you root that all in a solid conceptualization, and in that early phase, sort of, sometimes it's daunting, right? Families will come in with a lot of distress, a referral from a school or a pediatrician, some event. And there's a lot of disturbance in the system sometimes. And really the goal of the way we laid it out in that first phase is just to sort of get as much information that we can to inform, obviously, the diagnoses, and more importantly, in some ways, the targets that we'll be hopefully going after, and everyone will get a voice and a say, and that we can sort of build on this collaboratively, which is, one of the most important aspects of CBT. In my view, that we don't talk about as much, is that, the collaborative underpinnings, the collaborative empiricism, the aspects that hopefully come through in that first phase and beyond.
Yeah. And Sandra, you've also mentioned before that, the first phase of assessment is also it should be very educational, right? That, it's not just one directional where we're just passively taking in, the clinician should be passively taking in information from the client or family, but rather feeding it back more like that, the model of a coach, really trying to understand and listen and say so you're saying that your backhand is not quite like working on it. Show me, let me throw some balls at you and show me how you're doing it. And then let me give you some feedback and tell me whether that fits for you or not. And the same thing with any kind of assessment. It's like one should be feeding back some of your impressions as you go. And in that process is some sort of form of education, which is more of an active process than just sitting there and telling your experience and having someone passively listen to it. The other technique that's really useful in this early stage is that I think it's short shrift. It's surprising for behaviorists. It's functional assessment, right? And I think sometimes CBT gets slighted for its degree or type of insight that it kind of can pull from the person or process. And then we often are thinking it's more of a treatment process where you do to the client. But functional assessment and assessment in general is kind of our form of developing insight for the client, right? Because you're really sitting there and thinking, okay, tell me about a specific situation where you found yourself in trouble or stuck, right? Tell me like what was going on. How did you react? How did you feel? How did you react? And then tell me what the outcomes of those were. And I find that doing that with both, kids anywhere from like, even 10, 11 up, and certainly with parents, when they lay out that process, it's like light bulbs are clicking off for them, because even though they tend to morph everything together, like when it's just like, it's homework time and then we all get into a fight. And they themselves don't see the chain, the steps that go through that process. And laying that out for them is like a light bulb. And they say, oh my gosh, like, okay, so, if I'm telling him to, do the homework, or to stay with an individual for a moment, it's like, it's time to do homework. I'm feeling frustrated and I quit and I'm going through my phone. And if you ask them, oh, so how's that working for you? They say, oh, it's great because like, then I don't have to do my homework. Okay, but let's divide that up into the immediate outcomes and the longer term outcomes. And how would you separate that out? So in the moment, what happens? Well, it's great. I get to like, forget about the homework and just, get some relief for a moment. And then a little bit later, well, then I'm all stressed. Even later in that day, later in that evening, like I'm stressed out because then I know I didn't do it and then things are piling up and then I know my parents are going to be on my back. And it's laying out that stepwise process that then they're starting saying, oh, okay, I've been working on this solution that doesn't quite work in its entirety. It works in the short term, but not in the long term. And that's our form of insight. If we can get clients on board saying, oh, this is where I'm getting stuck, then you get some buy-in. Then you can start actually suggesting some strategies to help, cope with that situation. But so I think of it not as a passive exercise, but assessment and conceptualization is all about that feedback loop and chaining and creating some insight for the client.
And I'm wondering for you both, and I do think that, throughout whether it's the first chapter, those early chapters, it is certainly mentioned, but maybe for our audience sharing, like when we're in this early treatment phase, what does an effective treatment plan look like at this junction? And maybe we can kind of talk about how it shifts and changes, but, we're taking in this information, reciprocating with providing information, but, what should an effective treatment plan look like as we're maybe nearing the end of the initial treatment phase?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to jump in. And what does an effective treatment plan look like? Right? The goal is we're gathering all of this information, right, and trying to put it in one place. And there are different paradigms, right, to assessment. There's a diagnosis paradigm if we have to get to a diagnosis. There's also a communication paradigm, wanting to make sure that parents, caregivers are heard and that we're hearing about interference or functioning or disruption or what their concerns are. And of course, the kids too, who may or may not, self-refer, to kids are tough customers sometimes. They're not the ones knocking on our doors typically. And so in terms of the treatment plan, we have all of these data. We have all this information that we've gathered, in person, verbally, virtually. We talk a lot about using self-report and monitoring forms to feed back into that progress monitoring. And so we've gathered a bunch of assessments. And then the treatment plan should reflect all of that and sort of target, what the target problems are, what the target goals are, and sort of an agreed upon sort of set of steps in the beginning about how we're going to go about the business, in terms of moving from the assessment phase, although, as we said, it's all assessment and ongoing, which is part of the progress monitoring. You have to start somewhere and, thinking about how to begin, whether it's with psychoeducation about a problem at hand, whether it's about getting more collateral with a school. If there's school refusal behavior, we talk about school. I just listened to your episode about I'm a little behind a couple of weeks on the back to school time and sort of the chaos of this transition. And I loved it. And thinking about, we may need to prioritize depending on the calendar, right? If school refusal or school avoidance has been an issue, we might need to front load some of those in our treatment plan as targeting at the outset. And so the treatment plan at this, it's sort of doing the best we can. When you get assigned like a research paper, you can do a lot we can keep going on the searching for articles and stuff to go into it. At some point, you got to start writing and you got to start somewhere. And so the treatment plan is sort of this initial roadmap based on all these data that we gathered, the goals that we gathered from parents and our caregivers and youth, and doing the best about picking and sort of moving forward, from there. And I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, if I could just add, I was listening to another one of your podcasts also, is the one about words matter. It was really great. I think it was Paul. It's hard to tell. Your voices sound remarkably similar sometimes. But I think it was Paul who was making the point about intentionality of words and that words matter. And I think that intentionality is something that's kind of underlying all this work. And maybe I don't know if we made that as clear as you guys made it in the podcast. But, when it comes to a treatment plan, it comes back to kind of form versus function in everything we do. But in terms of a treatment plan, I'm much more confident in the function that I think a treatment plan should play rather than what the form of a treatment plan should look like, right? So I don't necessarily know that I have fixed ideas about the number of sessions or the ordering of the interventions or, who I should have involved, right? But the function of a treatment plan is to have, like Sandy's saying, this kind of roadmap to think, what are my checkpoints to do my formal and informal assessment? How and when will I update my conceptualization? And where should I start with my strategies based off of that conceptualization? And, what I want to encourage new therapists, senior therapists to do is when they're thinking about a treatment plan is simply just be intentional about it, really thinking it through and as a starting point, and then let the data, both formal and informal, kind of inform how that treatment plan evolves over time, but being intentional from the start. I think, I don't know if this is national, but certainly in New Jersey, we have this new regulation or law about kind of best estimate, that in practice, you're supposed to provide all clients with an actual fair estimate of how long and how much cost a client would be expected to incur by coming into your treatment. And it's like one of those public policy things that were said without really much thought about how it would be implemented, which is always problematic. But at the same time, I think the principle is right that yes, the therapists with their experience, training, and tools, could be and probably should be expected to kind of have an idea, like, hey, based off of my initial assessment, this is my idea about what you could expect, how long in general, and what we would generally do. And that's the kind of spirit that I think that we would advocate for, and I think we help out with in the materials of this book.
To that, that was really great, Brian. I think in terms of once you start identifying target problems, Brian mentioned social anxiety before or school refusal, we know the research is very clear on the effectiveness of exposures for someone presenting with an anxiety disorder. So, we will need to at some point get to the business of exposures. We may already be doing the exposure, right? The beginning of treatment with a socially anxious, youth in front of you may well be exposure and sort of finding opportunities to reinforce praise, use specific label praise to, comment on that and provide reinforcement for answering and effort and things like that. So we may already be doing the work of later phases in that first phase. And on our treatment plan, we know if anxiety is a target, heading towards exposures, or if a youth is depressed, how we're going to incorporate the behavioral activation. So, once you have that layout, that roadmap, that the point of doing it is so that it provides us with the pathways to the different interventions that are evidence-based and are effective and that we can then personalize for the family in front of us.
And I'm so happy that you both mentioned it, actually, I think a number of times. And Sandy, like when you had first said roadmap, like I actually wrote that down because, that I think that's the whole point of the treatment plan. Yet I don't know that it's necessarily called out in that way. Like, when I'm thinking back to my graduate program, it was very technical when we were talking about the treatment plan. And when I started off, in some different organizations, it was, okay, this is, the treatment plan is this step and you take this time to form this step and you're doing treatment plan reviews in this iteration. But it was never really described as that, this is the roadmap for effective treatment. And, we might have to deviate. We might have to change, same with a roadmap. There's construction, there's delays. We might have to, all of a sudden we need gas, so we need to make pit stops and address certain things. But ultimately, it's guiding us to this end destination and really kind of keeping that in mind. So I really appreciate you both calling that out.
Yeah, there's an exercise I do. I teach a class every year on fundamentals of CBT with interns, fellows, residents. And one of the first exercises I do is I say, draw me a map. And they're like, where, and so I said, you pick, and not surprisingly, a high number draw from their homes to a coffee shop, just remembering about the state of intern and coffee needs, but it's a highly represented destination. Sometimes they'll, draw a map from there to work, and, some are very specific, some side, subway, I'm in New York, and some, very sort of vague, but they start with what they know, and then they sort of go from there, and sort of the goal in that exercise is to sort of very much to what you're saying, Paul, is to next step is then we talk about case conceptualization, treatment planning as that roadmap, and how specific do you need to be? And then with some of these alternate routes and paying attention to some of the changing conditions, then sort of being able to sort of adapt as needed on our roadmap.
Well, and we've been talking a lot about this initial phase. And so maybe if we start to, transition, into this middle phase of treatment. And so what are the key markers that we look for that one inform when we've captured, as clear of a picture we can, good, Sandy, I love that metaphor. We have to start writing sometime, we can only look at articles for so long. When we're actually taking that information and putting it into practice in a more intentional way, certainly, the moment the client comes in, but when we're starting to reference that roadmap and maybe making some deviations, or we're progressing along it, what does that look like?
Well, I hope what we're starting to get across is that we did in fact organize the book in terms of phases, like early, middle, later stages, but these aren't the same as stages. So phases versus stages. And so it's not like you complete one stage and then you move on to the second stage and then you finish with the third stage. It's not a stage theory of treatment, but rather that these are, kind of Venn diagrams of therapy, right? That you're more likely to do more assessment procedures more intensively in the beginning, and then more of the kind of quote unquote active strategies in the middle, and then you're going to be bringing the plane down for landing towards a termination. But again, form versus function, it could be very reasonable to start with some sort of intervention strategy in the first session, right? And we're already talking about that in terms of being like education, functional assessment being forms of interventions. We could also lend ourselves to thinking that working alliance and rapport building is an intervention as well. But even, there are models of CBT where you start exposures in the very first session. And we wouldn't have problems with that either. And what that depends on is, what do you feel like you're getting in that first meeting? What could be accomplished in that first meeting? And if there's a sample or example, assuming a typical session and not some sort of prolonged, single session, do a little trial. Hey, we're talking about, calling or reaching out to like new kids in the school right now. I wonder, what would it be like for you if you were to text that kid that you're talking about that you just met at the lunch table today? What would that seem like to you? How would you react to that? Oh, I don't know if I could do that. Do you mind if we check it out and just try that out here to see, I'm asking you about your thoughts, feelings, and your actions. Can we see what that's like? And actually do an exposure as an experiment, as an assessment procedure there, and kind of like dovetails off of, or kind of hybrids both assessment and interventions. You could start that right away, and depending on how they respond, you could continue on and making sure that some sort of active behavioral strategy or cognitive strategy is there in every session from that point on, right? So it can be, again, overlapping phases of interventions. I don't know if that just sidestepped your question, though, Paul.
Well, no, and I believe I did actually misspeak. Using that term of stage and phase, and the going back to the intentionality of words. I wasn't as intentional as I should have been there. And When we are seeing this transitionary process into this phase, how do you see clinicians effectively using your book to help inform this? And I know those later chapters are very kind of specific in those ways, but how would you recommend clinicians using the book to inform this middle treatment phase?
Yeah, it's a great question. We think about how the book is laid out. I would say, the layout of the description of the phases was intentional so that we can sort of get that information out there and then refer back. The sort of older model of CBT was, you do all these assessments and then you pick a manual and you sort of pick that off the shelf and you deliver this, one diagnosis treatment. And our goal was to sort of go with this more principle-based approach. So I would say, read the front end material, and then thinking about when they have a particular family or patient in front of them, being able to sort of think about, okay, well, what is this main issue that they are presenting with? There's, we're talking about the start of the school year, school refusal. That is, something that it's not diagnostic per se, but something that requires a lot of intensity of work. And so reading that chapter, if that's a particular, presenting concern with a patient that they're working with. And if that patient also is likely having, depression or social anxiety, sort of pairing that up and seeing how that reinforces on some of that. It's meant to be principle, driven, not necessarily diagnosis driven, but the goal of sort of fleshing it out with the case examples was to tie it to some of the descriptions of those phases. The middle phase, it's sort of like, it when you see it kind of thing, right? So there are certain ingredients of the beginning phases of treatment that you're working on, this ongoing assessment, the components of, if a child is school refusing, how do we get them back to school? How do we enlist the team to do that? If there's a depressed, adolescent, how do we behavioral activate and start activation strategies? How do we teach and continue the psychoeducation? Our kids and caregivers, filling out homework. Homework is such a key ingredient in CBT. We have a lot of materials and worksheets and handouts intentionally. And so they're not meant to be given passively. Some of the handouts are in terms of information, but they're meant to be, useful in these sessions. And, being able to use some of those behavioral strategies, boards, stickers, some of the things that make being a kid clinician fun, reinforcement for doing some of the homework, because we believe homework is important. And so if we can get some of that stuff going, I think that's when you sort of will transition from sort of the early phase to that middle phase where you can then start looking at the data. That's what the tracking forms are useful for. And that will give you information on, sometimes self-monitoring is in of itself an intervention in terms of, things by nature of observing it. And, I love when kids point that out. That's such a good process piece to reinforce also. And so, if a clinician is then able to look at those middle phase strategies by using some of these trackers, tying it to the functional assessment that Brian was talking about, that all is the meat. That's the middle. That's the stuff that I think we're looking for change and looking for some of these change mechanisms.
I think one thing I would just kind of add as I've kind of was going through the book. Yeah, I think that you used the term kind of focusing on the principles. And I think that's really what the book does well, in the sense that, it's not diagnostic driven and, more of that kind of trans-diagnostic thought process as you kind of go through it. But I think as I read it, I think what's great, for new clinicians is to realize that these are not static phases. And that there really is this ebb and flow throughout. And it really is, I think a great guide to help people that when they get stuck, to revisit that case conceptualization and to revise. And that, we use the word working hypotheses because they truly are working hypotheses. So yeah, I appreciated how grounded it was in principles. And I think as clinicians read it, keeping that in mind can really lead to really good adjustments through treatment.
Yeah. I'll say we were trying to meet two goals, and then I guess the readership will tell us whether we were successful. But, we started at the beginning talking about these general principles, the phases. We described the, common strategies in general. like Sandy was describing, everything from like cognitive structuring, thinking traps, relaxation, behavioral activation, exposures, problem solving, such. So you get a description of them in general. And then we do organize the second half by diagnosis. And so we give separate chapters for depression, for suicide and SSI, for GAD, for separation, for social, and for school refusal. And by the way, that also follows some other focuses, foci on like working with families, collaborating with psychiatry, and working with schools. But the reason why we have the diagnostic focused chapters was to be able to take those general descriptions of CBT strategies and show how they're applied in different circumstances. So we're trying to meet both kind of needs so that you get the principles up front, but then you do see how it gets applied in very specific contexts and situations. And it also hopefully would serve the need of like, look, if you're a student or a clinician who has the time to read the whole book from start to finish, great. You'll have that, the general principles will be there, and you'll probably start to learn to apply them to your individual clients. But if you're also a busy clinician who knows you've done an assessment and you like, okay, my client has separation anxiety, I'm going to go to the chapter in separation anxiety, that could also be equally useful. It doesn't require you to have read the book from start to finish to make a lot of use of the materials in the individual, focused chapters. And so maybe that accounted for why the book ended up being so long, but we feel like it was trying to meet a couple of needs, and hopefully it did that.
And I'm wondering, for our audience, maybe sharing and talking about, from the initial phase to now this middle phase, how do you both view the treatment plan along the way? And it's kind of this updating roadmap, and, maybe talking a bit about how you go through that updating process, using the data, using all of these different pieces. What does a middle phase treatment plan look like?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, in terms of that's where the progress monitoring comes in, and the, consistent gathering of data, from the kids themselves, from the caregivers, from schools, even sort of, are we hitting some of those targets? We would, very rarely does therapy proceed linearly. There's always that one case, thankfully. And, we know that sort of having the data and the feedback and monitoring and being able to, we also chart and track some of the scores on some of the self-reports or parent report measures, which give us information on how some things may be going. We also might look to the barriers. What's getting in the way? Is it a psychoeducation issue where we might need to spend a little bit more time providing caregiver support on implementing the at-home plan? Do we need more information, like a daily renewable card from school, where we can get more information on how that's going if something is not proceeding as we might like? And the other truth of the matter is, our clinicians are overwhelmed, and as our families are. And so sometimes I remember doing a trauma-focused CBT training with Tony Manorino and Judy Cohn in that group. And they would always talk about the cows, the crises of the week. And families come in with a lot of distress. And I find sometimes novice clinicians will sometimes deviate from the treatment plan and sort of divert into the crises of the week, which then derails sort of our approach, when in fact you can always go back to the conceptualization. It's all, thoughts, feelings, behaviors, or it's all functionally accessible, right? And so being able to sort of use the middle phase in that way too, where we are incorporating the things that come up, the 2 days that the kid didn't go to school, and sort of we want to understand why and sort of get to the antecedents and the consequences using our functional assessment. And so, really using the materials, hopefully, to sort of then feed into and then course correct any interventions that were needed. We might need an additional caregiver session. I not so long ago had to pull a grandparent into the room because the grandparent was, as grandparents will, lovingly sabotaging some exposure work. You mentioned a grandparent in the book too, with one of the cases, and it comes up, when you're in intergenerational homes and things like that. So, when you go back to the assessment, then you can sort of course correct and bring in, some additional team members or, whatever needs to be done in that middle phase to sort of keep moving that progress, hopefully.
And as we're talking, I keep visualizing like in these phases, thinking of it as this kind of a road trip, and not a paper map any longer, but it's nowadays a lot of times the maps that we use to travel are our phones, and those alerts that we get that there's been a recent accident, or that this road is now closed, or there's a faster route that's suggested. And I really hear we're in the middle of our road trip, and we're getting this new data, and how does it inform what we're going to be doing? And sometimes it's faster, but this is the way that we're going to go. So this, because we have a plan. And other times it's okay, we are going to deviate some because, we need to get there at a certain time. And, this route is no longer getting us. So being able to see it as this really fluid, constantly updating because of the data that's being supported around it. If anyone's traveled with a phone, that's kind of this idea of it. You don't always take the path that your phone tells you to in the very beginning. It changes and it fluctuates. And really, if we can approach treatment in that way, like it gets us to this end destination.
And there's services that can help with that too now. I mean, this is a fortunate thing about technology at the time we are now. There's services that have like an array of self-report questionnaires that you can administer to clients on a weekly basis. And so it's up to us as clinicians making that part of the routine, like in the waiting room. They come into the waiting room, whether they're greeted by someone or not, that they just go on to the same link, that they pull up their phone, go to the link and complete the questionnaires. And these services score them for you. So it's not even like the hassle of the olden days where you had to bring out a clipboard and a paper and pencil, and you'd have to score it later and then put into some sort of Excel table yourself. Things are being made easier to do that so that you can be alerted. And we do know some good information about consistency of improvements versus non-improvements, and that can be indicative fairly quickly on about whether or not your client's on the right path or not. And so being able to monitor some sort of standardized measure is great, and also idiographic target goals. And so I think we have to be more flexible about how we do the measurement, but that can tell you a lot about whether the client themselves sees some real things changing in their lives. And that can tell you, this particular module that we're using right now, we're focusing on kind of cognitive interventions, really helping them identify their thinking traps and coming up with coping thoughts. If that's not having any effect that we're seeing, after 3, 4, 5 weeks, we should think about whether, what direction we need to be changing in.
And I'll say, I once had referred as one of the most separation anxious kids ever. And there was some truth based on my experience at the time. She threw an Ugg boot at me from the waiting room on our first visit. And so we would measure urges to throw her boot at me as middle phase, and I would praise her for not throwing her boot at me over time, in terms of, behavioral observation and, sort of catching and, some doing the work that we can do. And yes, we have these forms and feedback, and sort of also introducing some of the playfulness, that we know can be used with kids as measures that are meaningful to them. I had a socially anxious teen from a group that we were in, and we continued some individual work. She would talk about her Beyonce confidence ratings, and thinking about her increasing level of on a scale from 0 to Beyonce was her scale of ratings. And so using the sort of the data gathering as we do to sort of feedback, and using the language that we can connect with kids on.
And, I want to make sure that we have some time here, but we're soonish coming up to it. So maybe if we're talking then, this use of a treatment plan as a roadmap, it's to reach an end destination. And so maybe we can just spend the last few minutes here before we really start wrapping the episode up, talking about, what does this later treatment phase look like? What are the things that we look like to inform it? And, to then moving to discontinuing treatment.
I think we'd be talking about similar themes again, right? It's about being intentional. I think we've gotten into an over-reliance on, as Sandy was talking about, that this maybe a standard approach that I've been taught in CBT kind of frameworks has been, you do a diagnostic assessment, you pick the relevant manual, the manual tells you how many sessions to do, you do it, and then it's done. And I think that general clinicians are either over-reliant on that kind of preset, somewhat arbitrary number of sessions, either told by some treatment manual or by some artificial limit by either some third-party payer, or the alternative of having boundless therapy sessions. And in those cases, there's usually very little thought put forward to when we end. And my experience is that if you have that kind of approach or setup for therapy, that they tend to end in the same ways, is that you have an active part of working, and then sooner or later you start to see some sort of cancellations or schedulings, and the frequency of sessions start to wane a little bit, and then the client kind of fades out without any kind of official kind of resolution or agreement that we have ended therapy. And so between those two models, there has to be a middle ground, right? And that's about being, we talked about earlier, about being intentional, spelling out your roadmap. And so I have gotten into the habit of, even when I'm not working from a specific manual-based protocol, I will sit with the client early on. We do our assessment sessions, and then I'll give feedback, and I'll say, hey, here's my estimate, in concert with the kind of good faith estimate. I'll say, I think that we could, break it into two phases itself, like the first 8 or 10 sessions. I can imagine us working on these issues, and I would guess that we might be able to see some beginning changes in this. And by 18 to 20 sessions, we might see this, and we'd really know where we are at that point. And those would be preset as kind of your benchmarks of like, hey, let's sit down together and say, did we get there? Are we close to those benchmarks? Are we seeing the kind of change that you were hoping for? And or were there new issues that we hadn't considered and have added those onto the list, or have taken a different track? That's fine, but let's use those benchmarks to meet and retalk. And the same thing that goes so in that process, if at the midway point, we checked everything's going good, great. And then after that 20 sessions, we sit down and like, this really did follow the course that we thought. We were seeing these changes. We were really liking this. What do we think next? And that's where you can talk about how much longer or do we want to go for, really guided by the goals. As a supervisor, I'm always, frustrated is too strong a word, but I'm always tickled, maybe it's a better word, when students will come to me when we are working on a time-limited model of therapy, and they say, the client has to ask for more sessions, and I'm wondering, what do I say? It's like this kind of like seeking permission for, can I give them more sessions? And I'll say, well, what do you want to do? Like, what would be the purpose of more sessions? I'm like, I don't know. They just asked for more sessions. I'm like, well, maybe this will be a nice time to have a conversation about how are you in your goals? What new goals or continuing goals do we have? And together with the client, now that you've been with them for X number of sessions, they might have an idea about what they think they can accomplish in certain times, what skills they'll use, and how much more time they want to spend in it. And so have that conversation with them, and then bring it back to me, and we'll see if we have the resources / room to do that sort of thing. But have it as a conversation, right? That it's something that's intentional between the client and the therapist. So.
Yeah, and I think Brian mentioned sometimes you'll start to see these fading or cancellations, and we've had patients who have canceled, or we get a note from a parent saying, "Oh, he can't come because he wants to go to soccer practice." I'm like, "That's amazing. Let's get it." Yes, that's great. That's a good indicator that that we're sort of moving in that direction of behavioral change and seeing some of the sort of the functional goals that we might have been going after. The other point, when we're sort of entering this termination phase, I have two additional thoughts. Is we want to normalize that there will be ongoing challenges or future triggers or antecedents, or when you work with teenagers, then they'll have to deal with dances and proms, if that's an issue, or applying to college, or some of the shift from middle school to high school, that if you're sort of wrapping up an acute phase of a treatment or a first phase of a treatment, preparing them for, okay, well, let's do some relapse prevention. Let's look ahead and see what on the calendar or what's coming up ahead is sort of the normal stuff of everyday, anxieties that might come up, for example, or things that might be challenging about school. There's going to be a school break. And for sometimes kids with school refusal behaviors, that return back after a holiday could be a little bit challenging. How are we going to problem solve around that? And, thinking if you're terminating and wrapping up, there could also be an invitation to come back. So how will we know? How will we know if you need a little bit of a tune-up or a booster? Sort of shifting a little bit from our mental health model to almost like a dental health model, where when might you need a checkup, or when could we get you in for a couple of cleanings to really beat the metaphor down to the, but doing some planning and normalizing that, let's check in again if we can do that, or with somebody else, thinking about sort of normalizing that, we've done a lot of work here. Let's look at our success, picking an end date if it makes sense in terms of, all the progress that has been made, and recognizing that there may be challenges that, come at you, and how do we prepare for those? And then how will we know if maybe some of the older stuff is sort of coming back up and we might want to check in?
Yeah, I love that approach. And by the way, I also want to say that sometimes clinicians go into therapy, and maybe particularly students and novice clinicians, assuming that clients want endless number of sessions of therapy, right? And I found that the times are changing, and particularly in kid and family life, they've got a lot of competing demands. They've got soccer practices, ninja camp. They got all these different things that they got to do, and multiple kids and all this sorts of stuff. And they're watching the clock too. And it's not that they don't want to do what's useful for them, but sometimes you can get this feeling like the clients are also afraid to bring up ending therapy themselves because they're worried about hurting the therapist's, feelings, or that it's going to be met with some sort of resistance, oh, you really should keep doing this. And so having that conversation together, and this is what I love about, Sandy's, metaphor of the dental checkups is you can say that, I'm not kicking you out, but here's, let's think about in terms of phases, are we moving towards the end of our acute phase, and where we can move to more of a maintenance phase, and what will that look like? And so having that conversation, it can sometimes be very relieving to families, because they're like, oh, it's okay, yeah, that's great to know that I'm not offending you if I say that I think we've hit that inflection point where we can start focusing on other things. So we have other kind of mission critical things we'd like to focus on in our family too.
So with that phase, I guess we should kind of move into our last phase and kind of maybe start our wind down a little bit. And so, we like to kind of end our episodes with some takeaways. First one, we're the Psyched to Practice podcast, so we're always interested in what keeps you psyched to do what you do.
Oh gosh, so much. I mean, kids, I think what a joy and a privilege it is to be around them and work with them, and just it allows for their creativity, joining forces with them on sometimes some very tough things and tough times, and I'm never. I'm always aware of their power to be inspirational and funny and challenging and difficult, pains in the butts and all the things. And I think for me, that's the real joy. The other side is sort of the professional side, being able to teach and train and work with colleagues. And I think that always is a part of being psyched to do the work.
Yeah, I mean, I have to kind of just jump on that and say that I think one more recent kind of development for me was I'd spent my career, going into an academic setting, and where my emphasis was on training and supervision. And so most of my clinical contact was I started up this clinic at Rutgers, and I was training graduate students to do it. And so most of my clinical experiences were through the eyes of clinicians, right? And, it wasn't until more recently, maybe in the last 7-8 years, that I started to return to have my own little small private practice. And that has made all the difference. I could tell that earlier on, around midway through my career, I was starting to feel that kind of burnout, right? Like that, I was starting in the beginning, you're just reading everything, you're learning more stuff, and you're like, oh God, this is great and exciting. I want to share this. And then you start realizing that cohort after cohort of students, you start to hear the same questions year after year, and you start finding yourself giving the same answers year after year. And I was starting to feel a little stagnation, and putting myself back in a place where I was face to face with the kids and the families just was a wholly different way to kind of interact with people and this endeavor. And it gave me more things I want to share. That really made a difference, because it just, hearing the current trials and tribulations of kids and families always changes in context and with times. And so you just need to kind of, now it's Cardi B, but tomorrow it'll be someone else, right? You need to keep up with all the time. So it's that's what keeps me psyched is the fact that we entered into this field where it's an eternal learning process, and we get to share messages and lessons with other people is something that keeps me psyched.
This next question is a little bit difficult because we're going to keep you to one recommendation. So if you could pick one kind of piece of content, whether it's a book, a movie, a TV show, podcast, music, whatever comes to mind for those in the profession.
Clearly the answer is this podcast, right?
You got the right answer.
Yeah. Do I get another one? Because I said
you can have a second. We'll give you a break.
I'm gonna cheat a little. I don't have one, but I'm not going to give you a list. I'm going to say, in my view, based on what Brian just said and what we sort of hinted at before, I think we need to go where the patients are. And I think we need to sort of enjoy the content that they enjoy. And if that's a point of connection to do some of the personalized work that we're talking about, then, when I was in graduate school, I started watching the show Survivor because I had a patient who really liked Survivor. And, listening to certain music or watching certain shows or, I think to me, to make that connection with kids, I think, as Brian said, we sort of keep it fresh and go where they go.
Yeah, I'll give it a general one category, which is, I do think the podcast platform is a good one. And the ones that I'm really enjoying these days are ones that really focus on interviews. Maybe not so unlike this one, but there are many wonderful podcasts that talk about content, that organize their materials around content. But the ones that really focus on one-on-one people, and there's one that I've just gotten really turned on to, is by Justin Richmond, called Started from the Bottom, where this Justin Richmond just spends time with his interviewee and really understanding what led from their humble beginnings. He's really always focusing on people who are coming from the margins and from under resourced kind of beginnings to become very successful in their careers. And it wouldn't be surprising to many that a psychologist would really get into understanding those life arcs. But his is a great version of that. But just the kind of the long format interview is just really something that can be done in podcasts that are great. And even even it's less impolitic to give him an example these days, but like Howard Stern, his interviews these days, that he can spend so long with people, and it models a nice approach for students in terms of these forms of interviews of showing curiosity. And that's something that it's I say over and over, but it's hard to give examples to say, look, when ask follow-up questions that you're actually interested in, because, first it shows engagement, but, the things that matter to you are the things that will matter for this person. So, show interest and curiosity. And I just love, that format that you're hearing a lot nowadays, now that we're away from the 2-second interview clip on late night shows and stuff like that you can get these things. So seek those out. And those are a couple of examples that I've really found to like.
Great. And last question is, we like to get 3 takeaways or 3 gems that you would share that you've learned through your career that might help other clinicians and students.
Sure. Oh yeah. Just final advice. I will say that I've received good, I've needed a lot of advice over my career, and I've had good mentors. And so all of this is just repeating back things that I've heard. And The first one is, consistent with our approach and what we've been talking about today is like have goals, but hold them loosely, right? It's important to have a direction in which to travel, but be ready for that to change. And so have those goals, but hold them loosely. And early in my career, I had a pretty significant problem with making decisions. I just, there's so many options, and that's part of what draws you to this field is that there's so many directions to go in. And I was really struggling with that. And two pieces of advice that I received that really I hold with me to say. One was a quick one where someone just said, their own father told them this advice, which is, there are no right or wrong decisions. Just make a decision and then make it right. Right. And I say that to myself over and over whenever I'm kind of at a fork in the road. And the other one was a little bit more descriptive, and I'll attribute it to my internship supervisor at Tony Zeiss when I was describing concerns about just how do I make it this next career jump. And she said, Brian, stop worrying about what you could do in 5 years or 10 years from now. Think about what do you want to do today, and then do it. And then tomorrow, do the same thing. Think about what would you want to be doing with that day, and then do it. And if you keep doing that for 1 week, 1 month, a year, 5 years, 5 years from now, you'll find yourself doing the thing that you had wanted and were meant to do. And I try, and that's just good old classic behaviorism, right? Just to kind of stay focused in the moment. Now we have new language to talk about third wave stuff, like, just focusing in the moment and really and be values driven. But it's really about breaking it down to moment, because we can get lost in our bigger picture stuff. So those are the things that I hold dear and that guide my both professional work and personal life decisions. And
great. Sandy.
That was good. I think similarly as you started off, and this is what I say to trainees all the time is, surround yourself with good people and at different phases of your career. And that's true. People who will nurture your interests and, go to for different forms of support, whether it's mentors or colleagues and their endeavors with. And so find your people, find your people who support you as you move forward in your career. The other is, I think, use your platform. I think we are all, by nature of being clinicians, therapists, whether in an academic medical center or, a private practice somewhere, I think we all have a platform. Doesn't mean we all need to be, activists, but we can all be advocates in our importance of using our power where we have it and sort of advocating for those who are marginalized or minoritized. And we as mental health professionals in are needed voices in a lot of spaces. And so finding a way to use that voice. And there are many, many ways to do that. I think the other part is, be aware of the community you serve and be a part of it. So thinking about, where you work and the community that you're in. And that could be your immediate community, obviously, but your professional community or, where you might be of service. I think we need to give it away. We have a lot of really good stuff in mental health science. And I think much like this podcast, disseminating some of that, I think we need to find more creative ways to give it away in our communities. And I think whether it's through a lot of the technology that we're seeing or, stepping outside of our offices and being a part of the communities in which we work, literally, moving away from the model that the people will come to us, sort of where we hang our shingle or where we have our clinics. I think finding a way to sort of step out into our communities. And, I learned a question early that has gotten me into trouble, good trouble, as they say often is, if not you, then who? And so, if not you, then who for something that you care about?
Here.
Great. Well, thanks to both of you for joining us and sharing a little bit about your book and all the work you're doing. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you for having us, Ray and Paul.
And just one more time, again, can't thank you both enough for taking the time today on a Friday to talk about your new book. And I really hope that our listeners will go and check that out. But also wanting to let our listeners know, are there any platforms that our listeners can follow you on and staying up to date with what you both are working on actively?
Sandy is much better at promoting and staying in contact with people. You can find me on Twitter at Dr. Dr. Brian Chu, but also the YADC, where we do most of our kind of posting, is yadc.rutgers.edu. And we also have Facebook, mostly Facebook platform there as well.
Yeah, you can find me at times reluctantly on Twitter at Sandra Pim PhD, at Sandra Pim PhD. And I'm on LinkedIn as well if folks want to find me. And then Montefiore Einstein Psychology Internship page. That's the main sort of in our clinical psychology internship training program. Folks can go ahead and find a bunch of stuff.
Certainly hoping our listeners take you up on that. And if you're interested in hearing more and staying up to date with what's going on for Psyched to Practice, you can visit our website at www.psychedtopractice.com or following us on all major social media. We'll be back next week, but until then, be well, stay psyched. The information contained in this podcast and on the Psyched to Practice website is intended for informational and educational purposes only. Nothing in this podcast or on the website is intended to be a substitute for professional, psychological, psychiatric, educational, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please note that no professional-patient relationship is formed here, and similarly, no supervisory or consultative relationship is formed between the host, guests, and listeners of this podcast. If you need the qualified advice of a mental health professional or practitioner, please contact services in your area. Similarly, if you need supervision on clinical matters, please locate a supervisor with experience to fit your professional needs.